So in 1099, the First Crusade does the impossible, right? They capture Jerusalem. It's a massive, shocking victory. But then, just 2 years later, another huge expedition heads out, aiming to do the exact same thing, and it's a total, complete disaster. We're talking about the Crusade of 1101, a campaign that went from being a surefire sequel to an absolute catastrophe. So let's dig in and figure out why.
I mean, you really can't get more night and day than this. The win in 1099, it was this historical fluke, something that just blew everyone's minds. They set up actual Crusader states in the heart of the Levant. But the crusade that followed, it was an absolute train wreck. We're not talking about a small defeat here. We're talking about 3 separate, massive armies getting completely wiped off the map in Anatolia long before they even got close to the Holy Land.
And that right there is the big question, isn't it? That's the puzzle we're going to try to solve. Because when you look at it on paper, the 1101 expedition looked just as strong, if not stronger, than the first one. They had the big-name leaders, the money, the resources, and just as much, if not more, religious fire in their bellies. So what went so horribly wrong? What were the key ingredients that turned this thing from a victory lap into a complete and total failure?
Okay, so first up, victory and disaster. To really get why 1101 failed so badly, you've got to see just how much it looked like the 1099 success story. I mean, this was no disorganized rabble. This was a serious, well-funded military operation, all set to do it again.
Just think about who was involved. This new wave had some of the biggest players in Europe, guys like the Duke of Burgundy, the Duke of Aquitaine. We're talking about incredibly wealthy, powerful men. And they weren't going in blind. They'd heard all the horror stories from the first group, so they showed up even more prepared, with more cash, more supplies, the whole shebang. Seriously, all signs pointed to another smashing success.
All right, so that tells us we need to dig deeper than just men and money. We have to look at the dynamics, and that brings us to our first and maybe the most important factor, Christian leadership, or, the lack thereof. This is really a story of cohesion versus pure self-inflicted chaos.
Look, the leadership of the First Crusade was messy. Let's be honest. You had all these proud, super ambitious princes, and they were constantly at each other's throats. I mean, the fight over who got to keep Antioch was legendary. But, and this is the crucial part, they had a secret weapon. A guy named Adhemar of Lapuy. He was the Pope's man on the ground, the papal legate. He was the one who banged their heads together and made them act like a council. He got them to coordinate their movements, share info, and when it really mattered, they actually fought together to get to Jerusalem.
And the historian Jonathan Riley Smith really hits the nail on the head. He points to the exact moment things started to fall apart, when Adhemar died. He says his death removed the only objective and authoritative leader. Think about that. Adhemar was the glue holding this whole fragile thing together. He was the one guy all these bickering nobles would actually listen to. And without him, you've got a massive leadership vacuum, and that had some pretty terrible consequences.
And that vacuum leads directly to this timeline of disaster. By 1101, there's no Adhemar, no council, no cooperation, nothing. The Crusade shows up in 3 separate waves, and they absolutely refuse to work with each other. So what happens? In early August, the Lombards just ignore everyone's advice and march off on their own. By the middle of the month, poof, they're gone, annihilated. And the most tragic part? The other 2 armies then do the exact same thing. They follow the same route and get picked off, one by one. It's like a textbook example of how to get yourselves divided and conquered. Okay, let's switch gears. Factor number 2. Because while all this Christian chaos is unfolding, their enemies are doing the exact opposite. They're getting their act together. That divided, bickering Muslim world that pretty much handed the First Crusade its victory, that was gone.
This quote from the chronicler Ibn al-Athir just sums it up perfectly. He's talking about the situation back in 98 at the huge siege of Antioch. The Muslim relief army, led by a guy named Kurbaga, was massive. They should have won, but it just fell apart from the inside. Why? Because the other emirs couldn't stand Kurbaga. They thought he was arrogant and were literally planning to betray him on the battlefield. Can you imagine? They were more focused on their own petty rivalries than on the huge Crusader army at their doorstep. And that division was, without a doubt, the Crusaders' biggest advantage.
But losing Jerusalem? That was a massive shock to the system. It was a wake-up call like no other. The Muslim leaders learned a very, very painful lesson from that disaster at Antioch. So by the time the next Crusader wave washed up in 1101, the whole strategic game had changed. They were not facing the same enemy.
Not even close. In 1101, the Seljuk Turks and their allies played it perfectly. Ridwan of Aleppo pulls together a real coalition, and they're smart about it. They don't go for a big, pitched battle. They knew that's where the Crusaders' heavy cavalry was deadliest. Instead, they got clever. They started stalking the Christian armies, using hit-and-run tactics, picking off their supply lines, basically bleeding them dry. They lured them deeper and deeper into this harsh, unfamiliar territory. They were patient, they were strategic, and, most importantly, they were finally, truly united.
So this leads us right into our last two big factors, and they're all connected: allies and zeal. Basically, outside help versus internal self-destruction. Let's be real clear about something. The First Crusade would have failed, full stop, without the help of the Byzantine Emperor Alexios. He gave them food, he gave them guides who actually knew the brutal Anatolian landscape, and he gave them crucial military advice. The chronicler Fulcher of Chartres even called this friendship essential. Fast forward to 1101, and that relationship, it's in the gutter. Mostly because the Crusader leader Bohemond broke his promise and kept Antioch for himself instead of returning it. So this new bunch of Crusaders shows up, and the Byzantines are, understandably, deeply suspicious and not at all helpful. The Crusaders then make it worse by causing trouble in Constantinople, and in a truly fatal move, completely ignoring Alexios' advice to wait and unite their forces.
And finally, we have to talk about religious zeal itself, because this is a classic double-edged sword. During the First Crusade, that fiery passion was an incredible weapon. I mean, think about the siege of Antioch. The army was starving, on the brink of collapse, and then they find the Holy Lance. Suddenly, morale goes through the roof, and they win a battle they had no business winning. But in 1101, with no good leadership to guide it, that same zeal turned toxic. It became this reckless overconfidence, this impatience that led the Lombards to blow off all the strategic advice and march straight into a trap. It's the perfect example of zeal without strategy just being, well, just plain recklessness.
All right, let's bring it all together for the final verdict. When you put all the pieces on the table, the picture of why 1101 was such a disaster becomes incredibly clear. It had nothing to do with a lack of soldiers or a lack of faith. It was a total 180-degree reversal of every single condition that made the first victory possible. And this table really lays it all out. In 1099, you had leadership that, despite all the drama, worked together. You had an enemy that was totally divided. You had crucial support from allies, and you had religious passion being used for smart, strategic goals. 2 years later, every single one of those things is flipped on its head. The leadership is a fractured mess. The enemy is a united, smart coalition. The allies want nothing to do with them, and their own zeal just drives them right off a cliff.
And that, really, is the biggest takeaway here. The victory of the First Crusade was never a blueprint you could just follow. It was a once-in-a-lifetime perfect storm. You had Muslim infighting, Byzantine desperation, and frankly, a healthy dose of pure luck all coming together at once. The guys in 1101 thought they could just hit copy-paste on the whole thing, but they showed up to find that the storm had passed and the weather had changed completely.
So that leaves us with one last really interesting question to chew on. The total failure of 1101 really proves that the first victory was a fluke, an anomaly, and it makes you wonder, could anyone ever hope to replicate those perfect conditions again, or was the capture of Jerusalem just a freak lightning strike that was never, ever going to hit the same spot twice?